Yeah, so thank you all for coming to the last SPAAM seminar of this term. We have a very special talk today. We'll be having Dr. Ed Brambley talking about writing your first paper to give us some hints, tips and bits of advice, do's and don'ts and all sorts. Well, thank you so much. And
well, thank you for the invitation to come and talk. Yeah, as I say, if you've been to this last year, this is the same talk as last year. Maybe it's a refresher. Maybe you can tell. Maybe one of you can give it now. This is about writing your first paper. And as I say, that is my first paper there. Do you want to just click and then?
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. Okay. What I'm going to talk about is, hey, come in. Right, we've already started. So, why publish in the first place? What's publishing about? The process of publications from maybe you don't see the bit that happens at the journal's end. Something about choice of journal. Rejection, revision, and responding to reviewers, the most annoying bit about publishing. And then hopefully, eventually, acceptance and all of that is sort of really boring and factual to let you know what happens, and then, or what can happen, and then some advice that I have, this is very personal to me, I guess, on actually how you do it, what's important and what's not important. One of the things you'll find about writing a paper is it's quite an individual thing. You probably find that there's a right way to do it that your supervisor's told you or that you've discovered, and then you change fields or you have a different supervisor for a postdoc or something, and suddenly it's completely different. So actually, it is quite personal. Okay, so why publish? So let's just start things off. Does anyone have any ideas why you might want to publish a paper? Or what your own personal motivation is for publishing a paper? I mean, there aren't any wrong answers. Yeah, go on.
It's going to help you pass your Reviver.
Yes. Or indeed more generally for, I guess, personal stature, adding to your CV, researchers getting a higher number of publications. Or anyone else have any ideas why you might want to publish? Yes.
To go to conferences.
Yep. If that's what you need to say, again, this is quite field dependent. Some conferences don't even have papers. Some conferences have conference papers that don't really count as a published journal paper. Some conferences have actual proper journal papers. So yeah, maybe it's one of those, then that's a good reason to go. Anyone else have any ideas why you might want to publish something?
Yep. To hear feedback from peers.
Yeah, so get feedback from peers, that's right. Certainly during the peer review process, but maybe also afterwards. Anyone else? Because your supervisor says you have to. Actually, we're missing one really, really big one. We sort of hit on it there. Yeah, go on.
Because you think your work is actually could contribute and help other people.
Exactly. I would say that's the only reason. The reason you want to publish a paper is to tell other people about something. That's why we publish papers. The old-fashioned way, that's how you find out what research people are doing, because they publish papers. So there's lots of other things, because it makes you look good. Because it makes you look good. Because your supervisor, because you've got told to, either your supervisor or maybe even your funding body said you have to do it. Sometimes to show that you did there first, there's competition to be the first person to publish something. But I think really the real reason to do something is to tell other people about it. And that is going to feed into my advice later on how to write a good paper. A good paper is one that makes it look simpler than it actually was, because that's the right way to explain something to someone, rather than to show off how clever you are, which is to make it look more complicated than it actually was. Okay, so this is the publication process. It's a bit of a busy slide, but the bits in red are the bits that you do. So you write your paper and eventually you decide to submit it to a journal. That's the top left. And then when it goes to the journal will somehow assign it to an editor or an associate editor who's going to be in charge of processing it. And that editor will try and find some reviewers to send it out to peer review. And what typically happens is they'll send it out to 2 or 3 reviewers, and those 2 or 3 reviewers will decline to review it, so they'll send it out to another 2 or 3 reviewers, and eventually, after some process, some number of reviewers will have agreed to review. Now, because you often get given like a month to review a paper, and it may have taken them a month to find the last reviewer, the deadlines for all these reviewers are going to be in quite different places. There's really no predictability about how long it takes to come back. If your paper takes a long time to come back from review, it may be because they've struggled to find reviewers, or it may be because the reviewers they found have accepted and then forgotten about it. Eventually, after this process, some number of the reviewers will have submitted reviews, and the editor will at some point say, that's enough, I've now got enough to go on. And the editor will then make a decision about what to do with your paper. So the decision could be accept, in which case we go off to the right, or make some minor revisions, which usually means there are some changes you need to make to satisfy what the reviewers have said, but they won't necessarily send it out to the reviewers again. Or it could be major revision, which is usually the reviewers have said things you need to change, and then once you've corrected it, it'll go back and it'll be resent out to often the same reviewers again. Or they could reject it outright. In fact, they could even reject it outright without even sending it out for peer review. They could say, actually, this is not on topic for us, or something like that. Or they could reject it, but invite resubmission. So that's kind of like a major revision. It's saying, we think this needs a lot more work on it, but once you've done that more work, it was probably okay to publish and you can send it back to us. Okay, so most of those, you then go back to the beginning again, make some changes and submit, and you'll submit the document and also the comments to the reviewers. And this process goes round and round until the editor is satisfied. So you don't have to satisfy the reviewers, you have to satisfy the editor. And at some point, they'll say accept. So when they say accept, you'll get to submit your final version, which often involves a much more tedious forcing LaTeX down the throat of the submission system in order to get the original version on their system. And the editor will then accept that, and they'll sign it over to the journal's team. And the journal's team will first of all ask you to sign away your copyright, or if you're doing if you're paying to publish open source, or if it's a open access, or if it's an open access journal anyway, maybe you don't even have to pay, maybe the university pays on your behalf. We'll come to that in a bit. Then you don't have to sign copyright. Most of the time, you assign the copyright to the journal, and at that point, you now no longer have ownership of that document. They do. And then they will have some proofreaders who go through either carefully or less carefully and either mess up or improve your paper, depending on how you look at it. They'll probably make sure that you've got punctuation in the right places and after equations, and that you're using hyphens in the style that they want and abbreviations in the style that they want, and so on and so forth. So for good journals, actually, the proofreading is very impressive and very good. Splitting infinitives, which I've never really understood, but I can sort that out for you. And they will then create a proof of an article that you have to read through, and you have to read through that very carefully, because some things that they've changed will be highlighted, and some things that they've accidentally changed or been changed in the process won't be highlighted at all. And sometimes things will no longer happen automatically, like you may end up with equations that have got duplicate numbering, or you may find that decimal point has disappeared from a number or something like that. So you have to read these through those very carefully. And then eventually, once you've checked it through and you send it back to them, then it will, there'll be the final version, and they'll publish that online at some point. They'll give you a document object identifier, DOI, that will identify your document. And eventually, at some point, they'll assign a journal article. So it's sort of in press at this point. And then by this point, it's actually out and it's been assigned a journal volume and a page number. And increasingly now, page numbers don't actually mean page numbers, they mean a serial number, effectively. It used to be that a journal number would have pages, your document would be 5 pages long, and therefore would start on this page and end 4 pages later, and then the next document would start on the next page, and now you would find that you just get assigned a number, and that's your number in the journal, with gaps, all sorts. Okay, any questions about any of that process? For those of you who have already published, is this the process that you went through? Excellent, fantastic. Okay, choice of journal. Of course, your choice of journal might be it's the journal that your supervisor told you to publish in, or indeed the journal that your supervisor is an editor for, or something like that. But not all papers are equal, not all papers count equally. Some are really quite high-flying and also may or may not deserve that reputation. Nature, for example. Some are much more subject-specific and are really the right journal for you to publish in, even though they don't count as highly as some of the others. It's a difficult decision. So the things to think about when you're choosing a journal. The readership. Again, we said the most important thing about writing a paper was communicating an idea. So if you're going to communicate that, who are you communicating to? Who are the readership? Are there journals that you will read? Are there journals that your supervisor will read, that people at the conferences you go to will read? Topic, yeah, I mean, some journals are specific, less specific. The Journal of Fluid Mechanics is about fluid mechanics, right? Some are more prestigious than others. Some of them are more difficult to publish in, some of them are easier to publish in. Sometimes, not all of your papers are going to be outstandingly good quality. So it's okay, you know, sometimes you have a nice, clever idea, yeah, write that down, publish that, put it in a journal that's going to come out quickly where it's easy to get published, done, go on to the next thing, that's fine. If you're thinking about your CV, if you want to publish to get a good CV, people will look at two things. They'll look at how many papers you've got and how many papers you've got in good quality journals. And so the number of papers you've got is likely to be much higher than the number of papers you've got in good quality journals. So it's okay to publish some in the not so good ones if you just make sure you do one or two in the aim to have one or two in the really nice ones as a career goal, not as a PhD goal. Aim to have a paper as a PhD student, that's sufficient. Maybe it's a career goal, okay. If you don't know a field, there are various metrics that will try to rank papers for you, journals for you. They're all very flawed, but if you've got nothing else to go on, then that's a way you could do it. Some sort of citation metrics, for example. Restrictions. So some journals have a page limit. For example, the Journal of Fluid Mechanics has ordinary articles that could be any length, and it has JFM rapid articles that have a 10-page limit and a much shorter review cycle. Speed of publication, does it need to be quick? I mean, not 12 years, right? That's a bit long. But, you know, in theoretical physics, you know, they aren't really even worrying about journal publications. It's who can get it on the archive quickest. Whereas at the other end, I mean, I'm working on stuff that if it takes another 6 months to publish, that's okay. We'll just wait until it's ready and we'll publish it. But different, you know, there's maybe different amounts of competition in different fields, and maybe you might feel the need to publish quickly, in which case the speed of publication might be nepotism. Yep. Are you likely to get preferential treatment? If other people are going to do it, then why not? Also, you know, if you're going to publish something that is important but doesn't look like it is, maybe having an editor who also knows that it's important might help you, especially if you have some reviewers who don't notice the significance. This isn't trivial, it's almost trivial, but you know, each journal has a different style. Do you like having one column or two columns? Well, that's the journal that decides, right? Do you like author year or numbered referencing? I published once in a journal, and then when I got the proofs back, all of my equations were left justified to the margin. I thought, I'm never publishing that journal again. You know, yeah. Also, maybe there's already a body of work there. Maybe you are replying in some sense, criticizing or extending the work of another paper, in which case maybe you want to publish in the same journal that was in. Any questions? Yes.
Where would you recommend going for the journal metrics thing?
So I like Scopus.
Okay.
So I go to Scopus for a lot of stuff rather than Google Scholar or something, because people have to pay to be part of Scopus, and therefore other people do the legwork of making sure that there's only correct citable stuff there. And then their metrics may make more sense. So for example, they'll say, how many citations did articles in this journal have in the last 5 years, divided by how many publications were there in the last 5 years, and that gives you a citation metric. It's not brilliant, they're not comparable between different fields, but at least if you're going to have that as being your metric, make it a reliable one. So Scopus is where I'd go for that. It's a bit difficult to find how you search for journals in there, but you can get there. You have to click on sources rather than journals, but then you find it. Any other questions? Okay. Right, the revision process, review process. The most annoying bit. I mean, so annoying that it's caused me to write lots of words on the slide. Okay, so Things to remember. It's really personal, right? You've spent all this time working on this thing, and then someone spent an hour writing a review of it, and they say, yeah, it's okay, this could be with improving, right? So things to remember. Revision, even if it's a major revision, is probably a route to acceptance. So congratulations, if you've got major revision and lots of things that you need to do to your paper, you are not been rejected, therefore you are on the path to acceptance. Take it as a compliment. Even if it's rejection, rejection is basically just a more serious revision. So just try again, maybe even at the same journal, okay? Maybe with an easier journal. If you are going to, if it's been rejected by a journal, after peer review, you'll probably have the reviewer's comments. Even if you're going to resubmit it, either to that journal or someone else, revise it according to those comments and submit comments to the reviewers. It may be if you submit to a different journal that they won't know who the reviewers are, but it may well be that the reviewers get transferred and invited again. But irrespective of that, if you've made changes to the paper for a reason, then it's useful to tell people this is the reason I made these changes. These were the comments. This is how I've changed the paper in response. Don't take the criticism personally, even if it's really personally written. Even if they say this research has made, this has gone down the wrong route with this research. Like, no, it hasn't, but it's okay. All of these things you should treat as useful feedback. Okay, so the reviewers have not spent enough time reading your paper, almost certainly, but they have probably spent longer reading it than your average reader will spend. So they're a really good litmus test of how does someone read my document. And if they've got confused by something or misunderstood the importance of something, it's likely lots of other people will, so you can make changes to it so that it gets read better in the future. Okay. You don't have to do everything the reviewers say. It's your document, your name's on it, not the reviewers. The person you have to convince to accept your paper is the editor, not the reviewers. So if the reviewer says, you need to change this because it's not, this is wrong here, you can always write back saying, actually, we thought about it, we think it's right, we prefer to keep it as it is. Oh yeah, this is unfortunately the way that things work. You can bribe the reviewers by including the citations they've asked for. Often, in anonymous peer review, you'll know who the reviewers are because they'll ask you to add 3 or 4 different references to the same research group, right? Sometimes I try to deliberately put people off by suggesting 3 or 4 references to a different research group. But I think I'm unusual in that. I think the point is that if they've said, yeah, this is okay, it's mediocre, you kind of need to, you don't cite the literature enough, there are these other papers. You think, why would I cite those papers? They're not really to do with what I do. You can always add a paragraph saying, other research in the similar area that's different to this research is this and this and this and this. And then when it comes back to the reviewer again, they say, do I really want to reject this? They go, I get 4 more citations. Don't make the paper worse. It's your name on it, not the reviewer's name. Respond to all the reviewers' points. Sometimes they will number their points. Sometimes they will number their points, but also have some other points and some text elsewhere. Just make sure that every point they make is responded to. But respond in the document. Do I say that somewhere? I've regularly worked with collaborators who've written a response to the reviewer that's pages and pages long, and they explain in their response to the reviewer's question why the reviewer misunderstood it and how that's not going to help make your paper better. The thing to do is to change the paper so that people don't make that mistake when they read it, and then have a short sentence in the response that says, thank you for pointing this out, we've now changed this section so it now says this. Right? So respond in the document rather than responding in the response. Yep, that's that point. And if you can, yes.
What happens when the reviewers completely miss the point?
So it can sometimes happen. As I say, you have to convince the editor, not the reviewers, right? So if you respond back saying, yes, this reviewer has missed the point. But if that reviewer, who somehow the editor thought was appropriate to review the document, missed the point, maybe other readers are going to miss the point. Maybe there's a change you can make, however subtle, to your paper, that means that now far fewer people are likely to make the same mistake, in which case you can correct that and put it back in again. The reviewer is unlikely to come back and say, oh yeah, I was wrong, you are right. But they may well, it may well help you with the editor in that case. Sometimes the reviewers ask for the impossible, right? So one reviewer would like more detail, reviewer one would like more details, reviewer two thinks it's overly long and complicated. This quite often happens when you get someone who's in the field and someone who's not quite in the field, right? So you can play them off against each other. You know, reviewer one would like more details, while reviewer two feels the paper is overly long and complicated. On reflection, we're happy with the balance between detail and brevity in the current manuscript. Further specific suggestions from the reviewers would be welcomed, which is either please do tell us what else you'd like to do, or if you don't tell us what we're to do, then we're not going to do anything. It's one or the other, right? Okay. All of this is just sort of my opinion on this. Obviously, your supervisor's opinion is significantly more important. Things are going to be field dependent. But this is my experience of doing these things. Any questions on that? This is all quite abstract, so let me give you an example. This is my response to a reviewer's comments. Okay, so what I like to do, when you respond, they will usually ask you for a response for each reviewer. And what I like to do is I like to put them all in the same PDF document, ideally with the response to one reviewer and the end of the response to one reviewer and the start to another reviewer on the same page, so that no one can cut the pages out, so that all reviewers see all the responses and they see all of the, and I try to quote verbatim what the reviewers have said, so that all reviewers get to see what every other reviewer said. That's often you don't get to see what, as a reviewer, you don't get to see what other reviewers have said. And quite often I've done this, and one of the reviewers has stood up for me against one of the other reviewers, saying, no, they said they should do this, but they shouldn't, they're clearly wrong, this is the right, the authors are doing the right thing. So in some sort of appeal to transparency, I like everyone to know what's going on. So I do it like this. I have my response to the reviewers, this is my response to the first reviewer, and I then quote verbatim the text that the reviewer said. So they usually start their review by telling the editor what the paper's about to prove that they've read it, I guess. So this paper is concerned with properties of harmonic perturbations in a Lamarck vortex, blah, 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 okay. I found the paper interesting, but I think more detail should be given on the implementation of boundary conditions and the treatment of possible singularities. Then they go on, point one, you do this, point two, you do this, right? So in here, they've said a couple of things, right? They would like more details on the implementation of the boundary conditions and on the treatment of possible singularities. So then my first comment back to them is, thank you very much for the review. We are grateful to the reviewer for their careful reading of a manuscript, the manuscript, and helpful comments. This is probably to be contrasted to the review, to reply to reviewer two, which says, we are grateful to the reviewer for their helpful comments, because they didn't read it very carefully, reviewer two. Which we address below, including this point considering this thing and this point considering this thing. So it's kind of clear to the editor who reads this that we've addressed everything. Okay, point one, it's not clear how the addition of a term in the continuity equation plays the role of an absorbing layer. This point should be further documented. We think it was clear, but they don't think it's clear. So rather than having paragraphs and paragraphs here explaining why it was clear in the original one, we thank the reviewer for pointing out this omission. The term comes from using an idea from acoustics and then passing to the incompressible limit. This is now documented in Appendix B, which is referred to in section 3.1. Short reply, all the changes have gone in the document. Yeah? Okay. It's also not obvious that absorbing the waves always provides adequate boundary conditions. If you're simulating an infinite ocean in a finite-sized computer, you would not expect reflections of waves to come back from the artificial boundaries your computer has put on the problem, right? We do think it's quite obvious that absorbing the waves are the adequate boundary conditions. We think it's brutally obvious, right? But they don't think it's obvious. So push back a little bit, right? This depends on the problem being solved. In the present manuscript, we consider only trap modes and outwardly radiating modes, which the correctly outward boundary condition is a no reflection absorbing condition. This is more text than is here. Here we just change the document to be obvious. Here we're pushing back a little bit, so we have to explain why. But at the end of this paragraph, which is unfortunately on the next page, it will say, we have now changed the text in this section to explain this in more detail, or something like that. Everything's got a reason that we've changed the paper for it. Okay. For those of you who've gone through the review process, is this the sort of review process you went through? Yeah, does this ring a bell? Right. Acceptance. Your paper has been accepted. First of all, congratulations. When you pass your PhD Viva, the department provides Bubbly. When you publish your paper, they don't, but this is the right time to provide your own. Right? Getting a paper published is a significant thing. Even if you've got a supervisor who's published lots of papers, each paper published is a significant thing. Well done. Once you've signed the copyright transfer form, you have to be careful what you do with it because it's not your paper anymore, it's the journal's. You still have the copyright over your own material, the notes you had, the document up until the point you submitted it, but that document that's been submitted and any changes the journal now makes are theirs and they're not yours. So for example, if during the copy editing process, they change some text and you think, oh, that's better, I'll change it in my version, that would technically be copyright infringement. No one's going to check, but okay, be careful. Check your proofs thoroughly. Typesetters are not necessarily mathematicians. For the good journals, they actually have a good understanding of maths, but they're unlikely to be specialists in your area. They might not notice the difference between, that's a good example, less than or equal to or asymptotically less than or equal to. One's got a twiddly thing on the bottom and the other one has got a straight thing. Maybe they might get that confused. Maybe it changes the meaning of your document. You've got to check these things, right? We said the main aim of publishing was to tell people about your work. Having published is great. It's sitting there on a server with a whole load of other papers. Advertise, tell people about it, send a copy of it to some of your collaborators. Right? Send a copy of it, just so that you know, we've just published this recent article. I thought you might be interested in it because on page 5 it says this. Send an email. Put it on your web page, add it to your CV, any sort of online presence you've got, have a go at it. You guys are probably much, much better than this than I am. You know, make a short YouTube video where you explain your paper and put it online, something like that. Actually, someone did this for all of their papers and people loved it. Like each paper that they published had like a 2-minute or a 5-minute YouTube video of the researcher standing explaining, this is what's in this paper, this is what this figure means, this is what this figure means, this is the important thing about this paper. And they got a lot more reading of their paper, their results got out to a lot more people, which is the aim of it, and also they got a lot more citations because of it. Now that you've been accepted, you can update any draft versions you've got online to say it's now been accepted, like for example on your web page, on the archive, if you uploaded the archive, various other places. And again, when your final version goes online with a DOI, when you get a journal volume assigned, update these things again so that when people find your article, they find the correct thing. At Warwick, we have to submit these things to what is currently WRAP, the Warwick repository. It's important to do that because otherwise they don't count for the ref, which is how universities are ranked as how good they are at research. So we do need to, hopefully your supervisor should be doing that, but just make sure that they know that they're supposed to be doing that. As with all of your interactions with your supervisors, make sure they know that they're supposed to be doing that, right? So I do them on my website. I have a list of my publications. I find this extremely useful because I forget what I published and when. So it's useful to have one list in one place. So I update, every time I get a paper published, I update this website. So for example, here are the list of papers. This was the one on the Lamorcine vortex we talked about. It was submitted at this point, but not accepted. So it says it's submitted. We've uploaded it to the archive. If you click on that link there, you'll get a PDF copy of it, my PDF copy of it, not the German's one. And then similarly, once things have been accepted, I can put the full details here of the journal it was in, the page number. This is page number A8 because it's article 8. The DOI, again, any others. If you click here, you get my version. If you click there, you get the journal version. If you click there, you get the archive version, all subtly different. You might also want to make available other stuff related to it, like movies or source code or data or anything like that. You can put that on your website as well. This is also very helpful, for example, conference proceedings. Not all conference proceedings are available to everyone. So if you've written a nice paper for a conference and only the people who went to that conference have got access to it, then if you want to have everyone else have access to it, put it on your website. You have to be a little bit careful what the publishers will allow you to put on your website, but almost all of them have a clause in their terms and conditions, which aren't very long to read, a little bit legalese, but not too long to read, which say that you're allowed to put a copy on your own website, for your own personal website, and as long as you link to the final article or something like that. So this is what I do. This is a paper that's been accepted. It was published in the AIA journal, which is a 2-column format thing with special graphics and so on. This is not that. This is the style file that they gave me for LaTeX. So I just compiled it in that using normal LaTeX. It's the same text as it's online. And then when it was published, I added this to it, published in the journal and the link. And I think that's enough to mean that I'm allowed to put this on my website, even though you have to go to that link, you have to pay for the article. Okay, so I've talked quite a lot about the publication process, the nitty-gritty of doing it. What about actually writing the paper? Okay, so those of you who've written your first paper, how did that go? Did you write it and your supervisor signed off on it, or did they write it, or did you write it and they then edited it, rewrote it? How did it go? Yeah, go on.
I mean, in my case, I wrote it and then they went through it and they commented on it for
Fantastic.
changes for me to make.
That's probably the best way of doing it, right? Because then you get to learn from their expertise and what they think makes a good paper. Yeah, okay. Any other contrasting versions? No. Okay. So I think you don't write the paper up after you've done the research. I would encourage you to, as you do the research, write bits up as you go, because then it's fresh in your mind and you're explaining why you're doing something. And then when it comes to actually writing the paper, you just copy and paste it from your notes into the journal format and put an introduction and conclusion on it. Also, typically at that point, you work out what you're going to cut out, what you haven't quite, you've never fully finished something. So at some point, you've done enough research for there to be a paper in there somewhere, and you work out which bits you take out and you cut out, and you've got some idea about where it might go later, and you know a bit more around the subject. But if you've just done the research, right, I've done, now write it up, probably that's going to be after your PhD. And anyway, it's going to be, some of the stuff you'll be writing about will be stuff you did a year ago or more, and you won't be so fresh and be able to explain exactly what it is you're doing, what you're doing. If you are writing it up as you go along, the finished paper doesn't have to be what you did in the order you did it. It's very tempting to say, okay, this was the problem I wanted to solve, so I tried to do this and that didn't work, and then I tried to do this and that didn't work, and then I got this thing and that worked. But actually, from the point of view of writing a paper, it's much better to say, here's an interesting problem, this is the solution. By the way, if you thought about trying this, it wouldn't work for this reason. If you thought about trying this, it wouldn't work for that reason. It's a much easier way to understand it, because you're not confusing them before you simplify it. Whereas the way we always do research is we confuse ourselves first, and then we understand it and we've solved it. So it doesn't have to be in chronological order, but it should be interesting to read. Some papers out there, I'm sure you've all read them, are horrible to read. They're just a series of statements, one after the other, that you can verify that eventually after a week you can get from that line to the next line. And eventually at the end, when you think about it, you realize what it is you've actually shown in the paper. But a good paper should be fun to read, should be interesting. Here's this interesting problem. What's the solution? Why doesn't that work? Why does this work? Here's an interesting idea. Oh, look what it does, right? Ideally, it's not creative writing, but it is storytelling. You're telling the story of, here's this interesting result, what's out there. If you make it easy to read and you make it fun to read, more people will read it, more people will understand it. More people will put effort into understanding the difficult bits if you made it interesting and exciting. Also, some people who will read this paper will be experts in their field and will really care about why that's a 2 and not a 3 there. And other people will just be looking at this because, hey, this is an interesting field, and I wonder how machine learning works in this case. And they won't read all of it, but they'll see the interesting bits. Especially if you happen to be in a field where you can get picked up by, for example, BBC News or something like that. They're not going to read the maths, but they're interested in the exciting story behind it. So think about telling a story to lots of different people. Who should be able to understand it? Not just experts in their field. Think about the poor PhD student who just started, who doesn't know this field. Can you remember back to that, right? reading the first paper, and it's so complicated. And how did they get from there to there? You know, it's well known. It's not well known by me. You know, maybe it takes a few more pages to write a paper, but if you can write a paper that's accessible to as the first paper the PhD student reads, you'll get a load more people reading it and understanding it and working with it. Layout of the paper. Sometimes this is a bit formulaic. These are the sorts of layouts that I think you can see. You have the title. The title is probably the most important part, because when you list your papers, there'll be the authors and there'll be the title and nothing else. So what I do is I think about the keywords that someone who might be interested in my research might search for. I write them down in a variety of different orders and put and the and because in between them, and I end up with a title. So let's see if I can do a demonstration of that. This is a paper with acoustics, impedance surfaces, boundary layers, and it's a viscothermal 2-deck version. That's what's different about this one than other ones. And then what have I added in, over, and an. There we go. So that's how so when it says what are your keywords, I say, well, what's the title again, right? Those are the keywords. Okay. The abstract. The abstract needs to be more than just an overview of what's in the paper. It does need to be an overview of what's in the paper, but it also needs to be a sales pitch. Right? If someone has clicked on your article before they pay their money or put their login details in or whatever, they have got access to the title and the abstract. Scopus has the title and the abstract, but not the body of the text. So from the abstract, someone needs to know, should they invest their time in reading this? It also needs to sell what's new and novel. More so than ever now, with the ref, which is how, as I say, how universities are ranked according to research, experts will read your paper and they will say, is it 1-star to 4-star in quality? And we think that there'll be experts, but not necessarily experts in your area. And we think that they have about maybe 10 minutes per paper to read through, stack after stack after stack of paper. So they'll be reading the title, the abstract, maybe a bit of the introduction, maybe a bit of the conclusion, maybe flipping through, seeing some of the things on the inside. So the abstract is really where you have to say, why is this a really good paper? What's new or novel? So ideally, I don't know if I did it this one. This is probably before I did that. Let's have a look. No. Okay, this is a bad example of an abstract, right? So I've just read the first 2 sentences and I'm being told what's happening in the paper rather than why I should care. Where I should care in here? The new boundary condition is found to correctly predict the attenuation which are poorly predicted by existing models. Okay, that should have been in the first sentence. Right? We are encouraged now to write, for the first time, this work, something. Right? Because you're publishing something, there will be something in it that's new, however minimal, and this is your chance to sell it, basically. So, abstract, you need to make sure that you sell it. Introduction. I find, again, maybe some of this is my own personal preference, I find the introduction should be looking backwards. What's already happened up to what I'm doing. And the conclusion should be looking forward. It should be saying, this is what I've done and this is where it's going next. This is what it might influence it might have. That's your place for conjectures. And a minor point on the inside is that if you've got figures, ideally, from looking at the figure and looking at the caption, you should understand what's in that figure without having to read the text, because people are going to flick through. I think I'm just going to... Okay. This is my penultimate slide, I think. Yeah, pretty much. Sub-penultimate slide. Okay, actually doing the writing style. I'm not the right person to tell you about writing style. I think I can write my own papers relatively well, but not brilliantly, and I don't think I can articulate what it is in them that I can do well. But other people have done these things. Couple of points. Writing a maths paper is not like getting a high mark in an essay was at school. You don't get bonus marks for using a wide vocabulary. In fact, you probably get minus marks for doing so. Your maths is probably really hard to understand because it's state of the art. You want everyone's brain power to be going on understanding your difficult maths and none of it to go on understanding your difficult sentences. So ideally, short sentences, small words, Here's an example from a paper that I'll show you this reference at the end as well. This is called Lucidity in Science, written by a guy who isn't very lucid. It's volume 1, it's article 1 of 3 papers. You only need to read number 1, which tells you all you need to know about him. But he says some great things in it. So what he says is, here's an example. Whereas the spectral method engenders Gibbs fringes, no discretization oscillations are manifested by the TVE algorithm. And you might think, oh, well, I'm not a specialist in this area. I don't know what Gibbs fringes are or the TVD algorithm is. And this is actually what they meant to write was, whereas the spectral method produces Gibbs fringes, the TVD method produces no Gibbs fringes. Now that's clearly much clearer than that one. And the reason is, it's repetitive. It says, produces Gibbs fringes, produces no Gibbs fringes. Yeah. And here they've tried to use a wider vocabulary and a different structure to show off their maths, their English, and they've failed at understanding maths. There are many more examples. This is another one. Arrow layout, key layout, a choice of style. If your arrow keys were like that on your keyboard, you would not be able to use them to go up, down, left, or right. It's not a matter of style, it's a matter of function. Similarly, your supervisor may well have an idea about this, whether you should use we in a paper. We now substitute this equation into that one and get this result. Or this equation is now substituted into this to get this result. It's sort of a matter of style. I don't think I care too much about it. But there is a specific thing, which is that we, if you write in a paper, we now do this, you mean I, the writer, and you, the reader. And so we will see later that this is a special case of something. It's fine, because I, the writer, and you, the reader, will see when we get to this next section that it's like that. But we found slow convergence with explicit time stepping, and so we used an explicit art scheme. No, I used the explicit scheme. You're the reader. You haven't used this scheme yet. You're reading the paper. So that's technically wrong. But you can also use passive voice if you want. Passive voice often makes sentences longer and more complicated, but maybe it's your choice, I guess. And there's lots of other stuff, and I would just say, don't worry too much. The journal editor or your supervisor will sort them all out. So there's different sorts of punctuating the end of equations, whether you use a penultimate comma and list of things, different sorts of dashes and hyphens and semicolons and all sorts of stuff. Yeah, don't worry too much. Get the maths down, get the words down, someone else will sort out the rest. And as I said, I'm not the right person to talk about style guides, but there are these 2 that I would recommend. There are lots out there, but these are the 2 that I would recommend. This is a lovely one written by some linguists on the science of scientific writing. It's unfortunately not the science of scientific writing, it's examples in scientific writing. But it is brilliant because what they do is they take actual papers that have been published and critique them and reword them again, and they introduce different concepts of this is how you write something clearly, here's how we show this was written poorly, now we've done what we said we should do, this now looks clearer, and by the end of it you can see it's clearer. And there's one lovely example towards the end of that where they take some really relatively complicated sentence about something in biology and they reword it and they reword it and they use all the techniques they have to get rid of all the ambiguity in the wording. And when they get to the end, they end up with a statement. They say, we aren't sure if this is what the author's meant to say, because it looks like now we've got rid of the ambiguity in the language. Actually, the authors weren't sure what they were saying. There's ambiguity in the scientific context. So but this is a really fun, interesting read. And again, this is a technical thing on how to do this. But it's fun, it tells a story, it introduces you different styles. You want to read it, this is a fun one to read. This one is also similarly interesting. Again, I say only read number 1, and it's also not particularly lucidly written, so don't do as they say, not as they do, right? But this has got some lovely examples about if you're wanting to communicate an idea clearly to someone. I think the whole pretext of this is, if you want to communicate an idea clearly to someone, what you need to do is, you've got an idea in your head of what things are, and you need to transport that idea into someone else's head, and the only tool you've got to do that is language and diagrams. You don't explicitly need to say everything in your idea. There's a compression that goes on in between. You just need to say enough so that unambiguously the idea they get in their head is the same as the one you meant. As long as you do, so there are examples in there of making use of the brain's automatic processing to fill in gaps in such a way that it's okay. They're going to fill it in the way you want it to. So you can say something short and they'll understand what it means without having to. And it's difficult for a mathematician. We like spelling everything out rigorously, but you don't have to. And sometimes it's better not to. That's what's in that paper. Okay, so slightly over time, I apologise. These are some links you might want. Those are the 2 style guides. And if you want anything else in this, you can go to that website and it will give you a link at the bottom to this presentation, which you can download. Thank you very much.